Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and today I want to review the final episode of Season 1 of The Mandalorian. And I thought this episode was excellent, very entertaining, it had a lot of humor, a lot of great action scenes, great special effects, a lot of emotional stuff, and this review will have spoilers, so if you didn't watch the episode, it's probably best to watch it before you listen to reviews like this. And before I talk about this episode, I also want to mention a few things which I missed in my previous reviews of the show. For example, when I was talking about Quill, I just called him a midget alien, and I didn't realize until someone mentioned in the comments that he's the same species as those little guys that we saw in Cloud City in The Empire Strikes Back. Those mechanical guys who were helping out with the carbon freezing and all of that. That's the same species as Quill in the show. And I totally missed that fact. I think I caught pretty much all the other references in the show. They always had a lot of stuff, especially from Empire Strikes Back. But this is something which I missed. I guess I never really took a close look at those guys in Empire. And also the makeup itself is not really identical. It's a little bit different, so that's my excuse. So I totally missed that reference. And it's also funny that he mentioned that he used to work for the Empire. So technically it's possible that he was actually one of those guys that we saw in Empire. Maybe one of those guys is actually Quill. And we know that he's also a tech guy. Maybe all these species are like that. Maybe they all love mechanical stuff. They're all technicians. So anyway, that was a pretty obvious reference which I missed previously. Also, I made a few predictions about the last episode of the season which did come true. For example, I said that he will get the jetpack in the last episode, and he did. I also said we will see his face in the end of the season, and we did. And I said he will learn to trust droids because they kept showing us how much he hates droids. I guess because he saw a droid killing his whole family in those flashback scenes, and so probably that's why he hates all droids. And I said that by the end of the season he will love droids, and so that also kind of happens. So some things in this episode were kind of predictable, but still awesome nonetheless, and so it doesn't take away anything from the show. The show's only kind of weakness, I would say, is that it's kind of simplistic. It doesn't really have a very deep or complex story, but it doesn't have to be. Not every movie or show has to have very complex stories. Sometimes simplicity is a good thing if it's still fun and kind of a show for the whole family and stuff like that. So not every movie or show has to be complex and a show for the whole family and all of that. Still, I personally would have preferred probably a little more complexity in the story. Then I would have said that this is a perfect show, but other than that, it is pretty much perfect. Visually, it's great. It's better than any of the movies, I think. Also, there was a lot of humor in the show, a lot of moments which were really hilarious. And all the action scene, it has that perfect balance in that exact right range of still being realistic, still being plausible, that you can get into it and you can feel the stakes, you can feel the danger, but at the same time being very fun and funny and kind of over the top in a good way, still in that realistic range that you can still get what's happening without it becoming totally unrealistic in a way that takes you out of it. So it really hit the spot in that exact range, in the right balance between all of those things, which is very hard to do. The recent Star Wars movies, for example, didn't hit that mark in my opinion. But this show does. This show is able to keep you on the edge of your seat, feeling the suspense and tension and danger to the characters, but at the same time having funny moments, levity, humor, and all of that. The new bad guy, Moff Gideon, was excellent as well, the same guy who played Gustavo Fring on Breaking Bad. And they had a little joke about him always killing his own men and all of that, so that was kind of a reference to how we saw the Empire in the old movies, how Darth Vader always killed his own men for any minor failure or just for interrupting him and stuff like that, so that was kind of a funny joke. And we had that funny moment of those two stormtroopers testing out their guns and they cannot hit anything with the guns, so that was like a funny in-joke about how all the stormtroopers couldn't hit anything in the old movies. So here like one of the stormtroopers is annoyed that his gun is defective, so that was a funny joke. This one maybe breaking the fourth wall like a little bit, like it makes it a little bit too silly, too unrealistic. Especially when he kind of looks into his own gun, that kind of makes him seem a little bit too stupid, so that was the only moment when I felt like the humor is endangering the realism of the show. All the stuff with Baby Yoda is great as always, a lot of cute moments, a lot of funny moments when the droid was taking him on the bike and shooting all the stormtroopers, and Baby Yoda was kind of laughing at that. And also a very funny moment in the end when someone told him to use his magic hand wave and then he kind of waves at him. That was super funny and super cute. But the one who really steals the show in this episode is IG-11. I thought that was absolutely hilarious and great. The way that he was a total badass. He was a nurse droid, so he wants to protect Baby Yoda, but he's still a little of his old self, and so he's going around town killing all the stormtroopers, and he's jumping around, and he's being so effective in a very badass way, but also hilarious, also funny at the same time. And I talked about this droid in my very first review of the first episode, and I explained why I love what they did with this, so I don't want to repeat myself too much, but just in short, when I saw that similar looking droid in Empire Strikes Back, I always thought it looked totally ridiculous. They had a droid who is a bounty hunter, and he looks like that thin kind of pipe, kind of very fragile looking, so it always looked ridiculous, and yet they kept that exact same look and made him a badass in this show. It's not the same droid, but it's the same type, and they managed to keep him looking exactly the same, but also being a badass at the same time, and I thought that was absolutely brilliant. And it also kind of retroactively fixes that scene in Empire Strikes Back. Whenever I rewatch that movie now, and I see that droid which I used to poke fun at, now I won't. Now I will respect him, because now I know what they're capable of. And this is exactly the kind of stuff that I always say that a good prequel or sequel or a spin-off should be doing. Making the old one better. Instead of being embarrassed by it and hiding it away or trying to reimagine it, like what Star Trek was always doing whenever it did prequels. It was embarrassed by its own material. Here in The Mandalorian, they take all that old stuff, they don't try to reimagine it or make it look different, they keep it exactly the same, but also make it better at the same time. And that retroactively makes the old movies actually better, and so that's great in my opinion. And so I absolutely love everything they did with this droid in this show. It might actually be one of my favorite robot characters from now on. And not just because they made him so good visually and such a badass in action scenes, but mostly because of the personality they gave him. They managed to capture exactly the kind of stuff that we always loved in robot characters. Characters such as Data in Star Trek, or the good Terminator in Terminator 2, or the Iron Giant, all those kind of lovable robot characters they managed to do with this droid. So for example, his selflessness, the willing to sacrifice himself to save others, the way that he's kind of childlike and naive but badass at the same time, the way that he's funny and humoristic, with kind of unintentional comedy, all those lovable traits that we always loved robot characters for. They managed to capture all of those kinds of elements into this new droid, and so this one might be one of my new favorite robots in science fiction. And even visually, I now love that design, which I poked fun at previously, because he looks so fragile, so thin, and yet he moves so efficiently and also so robotically, and so you can see that it's actually a robot, the way they made the special effects. You see that it's not just a guy in a suit. You can see that it's an actual robot, and the way that he's spinning around in a way that is inhuman and all of that, and so that makes it much more interesting and badass and funny, all of it together. And I also think they kind of added in deliberate references and paid homage to characters such as the Terminator in all those scenes of him protecting the child. He's kind of rotating and shielding him with his own body from the blaster fire, and he's riding with the child on a hoverbike. That's kind of like the motorcycle chase scene in Terminator 2 when he saved John Connor on a bike. Also there was a scene of the droid catching a Stormtrooper's hand and crashing it, just like the Terminator did, and also Data did that in one episode. And especially in the end, and another spoiler warning, in the end of the episode, the droid sacrifices himself to save the kid, and it was very similar to how Terminator 2 ended, when the Terminator willingly sacrificed himself and was lowered into the molten steel. And here this droid also sacrifices himself to save the kid, and even he kind of pets him a little bit before he goes, and then he steps into a lava river. And it was almost as emotional as that scene in Terminator 2. Maybe not as much, simply because we didn't spend as much time with this droid as we did with Arnold in Terminator 2. So there wasn't as much of a bond between him and the kid, and all of that. Also the kid doesn't really fully understand everything, and so it wasn't on the same level, but still had that element, and it definitely succeeded creating an emotional response. I definitely felt the vibes of a Terminator 2 kind of ending, and it's really amazing considering how little time they actually spent getting to know this droid, and yet still we feel that about this ending. And so it's pretty impressive. My only complaint is that that means we got too little of him. Like, I wish he would have been a recurring character for longer. But for the time that we had him, he was great. and he used that little bomb he had inside of him to self-destruct, and that was something that was shown in the very first episode, and so I love that it wasn't out of nowhere, but it was actually set up previously. And also I love how all of this explains away the continuity issue which I would have had with the show if not for this explanation. Which is that because this droid was so advanced, I definitely would have asked why the hell is no one else making these droids? If it's possible to have such a badass droid, why did all the other droids we saw were so much more pathetic than that? Why didn't the Separatists use droids like this in their war against the Republic? If they did, they probably would have won easily. But they explained it away by saying that this is some sort of secret technology that the manufacture of these droids prevents from being captured by anyone else, because these droids always self-destruct before they are captured, and that's why their technology cannot be salvaged. And so this explains away what could have been a continuity issue. So they simply self-destruct and are never captured, and that's why no one is able to mass produce these kinds of droids. I'm also assuming that he's made from some very expensive material, because we can see him taking hits from blasters without much damage, and we know that other droids easily get killed by blasters, and so I presume that he's made from some very tough and expensive materials. And so even if this technology became available to others, that doesn't mean they would be able to produce an army of droids like that, because you would have to have a lot of such materials. So droids like this would probably only be used as some kind of elite units, and not really as a whole army, because you wouldn't have enough materials or enough money to make a lot of droids like that. Also, the fact that he managed to walk through lava for as long as he did without melting, it also shows that he's made from some pretty tough materials, because other droids would probably get melted down in seconds. We actually saw that in episode 3 when R2-D2 sprayed a few battle droids with his oil and lit it up, and he immediately got fried from that and immediately melted. And so that shows the difference between the cheap battle droids of the Separatists to droids like this, who are actually much tougher. And so I'm very happy that they explained away this continuity issue by saying that they always self-destruct, and that they are made by some mysterious manufacturer who wants to keep all its secrets and so on. And maybe we'll see another droid like this in the future. That would be great. Of course, personality-wise, Quill reprogrammed this droid to be a nurse droid, and it's probably not something that anyone else would be able to do, and so that's too bad that we didn't really have this guy for longer. I also liked how Mando came to appreciate this droid after, for the entire season we saw how much he hates all droids, probably because a droid killed his family, and so he kind of didn't want to trust this one, but this one proved himself loyal and all of that. And then Mando didn't want him to sacrifice himself, once again kind of a Terminator 2 homage probably. I half expected this droid to say, "I know now why you cry, that is something I can never do." And when he blew himself up to kill those stormtroopers, I half expected him to say, "Hasta la vista, baby." And by the way, I made a parody video on my other channel showing that scene with the Terminator 2 music, but it got blocked almost immediately. I might make another version later, maybe a shorter one, and maybe I'll mix it up some more so that they won't block it. I'll make it more comedic maybe, because I just found all the similarities funny and probably not a coincidence. But I don't mind that, because it still works as its own story. Like, I didn't feel like it's simply ripping off other movies. I felt like it's doing its own thing with a little bit of reference in a good way, in a good-hearted homage kind of way, not just as a rip-off. Instead, kind of just tipping the head to it a little bit, which is great. It's really amazing how they managed to capture all the things we loved about robot characters. So the humor, the emotional connection, the selflessness of robot characters like that, how they are willing to save others on their own expense and all of that. So that all makes them very heroic and lovable characters to us. And considering how little screen time this droid actually had compared to the emotional impact, I think this was absolutely great. And in the end of the episode, they had that great showdown between Gustavo Fring in a TIE fighter and the Mandalorian with a jetpack. And that was absolutely great visually and very fun. And they managed to make the TIE fighter seem actually scary, and that's something they often do in this show. They take something little from the movies, which in the movies was kind of pathetic, and yet they make it seem so scary and badass in the show. So they did that with that little walker in episode 4, the same walkers that we saw easily defeated by Ewoks in Return of the Jedi, and yet in that episode in this show it was actually scary, it was kind of a monster in the woods and all of that. And here we have a TIE fighter of the same type which was always taken out so easily in the movies, and yet here it's actually scary. And this is also something great which also kind of improves the movies in retrospect, because now we see that each of these war machines is actually powerful and scary, and so in the movies it makes it much more epic, that now that we know that every little one of those devices is actually super powerful, so it actually improves the old movies, and so that's great. So we see Gustavo riding that TIE fighter and shooting them, and then Mando uses the jetpack without any training, and he immediately manages to latch on to the TIE fighter, and all of that felt so much like those classic adventure serials and adventure movies, you know, Indiana Jones, James Bond, Batman, and all that kind of stuff, that superhero kind of stuff, and he has the cape and the whole 9 yards, the whole deal, and it was great. It was had that adventure feeling to it, and kind of a little bit silly in a good way, but still realistic as well, and so it was the perfect balance between all of that. It even reminds me of Captain Proton from Voyager, you know how Tom Paris always went into the holodeck and played some old character as if from some old serial, kind of like the old Flash Gordon and stuff like that, and he also had a jetpack there and stuff like that, and so this episode kind of captured that kind of stuff, but in a new and exciting way, with new special effects and looking great and looking realistic, but still with that fun adventure kind of stuff. So that was absolutely perfect. And then in the very end, Gustavo survived, and then we see that he has a black bladed lightsaber, which is called the Dark Saber, which I think was in one of the cartoons. I think it was explained in the expanded universe that the first Mandalorian, who was a Jedi, created this unique lightsaber that has a black blade, and now we see that this guy also has it. So I'm guessing he has some kind of connection with the Mandalorians, and I'm glad he survived. I'm glad he will be a recurring villain, and I think the show should be kind of expanding the stuff that they introduce instead of getting rid of them quickly. The show should actually expand and build on top of the stuff they introduced. And villains are also important. It's a good idea to have a recurring villain and not just new ones all the time who always gets dispatched, and so it's a good thing that he survived, in my opinion. And apparently Mando will now go off to look for Yoda's home planet to return the baby to them, which I think is great. It will be very interesting to see that planet finally, and to see a whole bunch of Yodas. That might be very fun. So to summarize, I think this was a great episode and a very good season overall. I really enjoyed it. And you know, if not for this show, I might be saying that Star Wars is dead, because the recent movies were not that good in my opinion. But this series is doing what the movies should have been doing. They actually make us care about the characters, and then when you put them in danger, then we feel the stakes. Even though the plot is kind of a little bit simplistic, I complain about that, but overall it's still very fun. And you know, I rather it to be a simplistic and coherent story than some kind of jumbled mess that still has no real story to it, like the new movies were. And so this show is a million times better than the recent movies, in my opinion. So that's my review. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and we can discuss it in the comment section, and I will see you all next time. Bye bye.